Well, thank you for just the warm welcome to your time over these couple of days, and I'm grateful that I can have this time this morning to speak with you. I was a little intimidated when I got the title of the theme of confident ministry. I don't feel very confident in this area. I just want to be honest about that. I shared in a book I had written on emerging gender identities that I felt like I was being asked to repair an engine on an airplane that was flying at 30,000 feet, and that there just wasn't time to land and to get it into a maintenance hangar and do the proper work on it. But I have families coming to me, very similar to probably families coming to you. And I do have it every week, but and it feels very difficult to know, as I pray for wisdom and discernment and prudence, just how to navigate really complex issues. And if you're feeling that, I'm feeling that with you. So my confidence will be tempered, but hopefully maybe together we can grow and pray that God would expand our capacity for confidence in an area that as He guides us. I do direct the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute at Wheaton. I developed this years ago in Virginia at my previous institution where I served for 21 years, and I moved it to Wheaton about 4 years ago. And no one does research by themselves. I want to acknowledge the fellows that I work with, 16 undergraduate and graduate students who work with me. I teach in a PhD clinical psychology program. I'm surrounded by very eager and ambitious students and tremendous colleagues who sow into my life, and nobody does research by themselves. So it's a little misleading to have me speak here. They should probably have about 20 people behind me who do this work. And then here's a few resources that we've been developing. The three on the left-ish, are more on gender identity, and the one on the right is for parents. It's called When Children Come Out. And so what are we learning over conducting research with Christian parents? What happens over the next 4 or 5 years in their life? And that may include people here today. What does the journey look like for them in the relation to their loved one who's come out to them, in relation to God? What has their faith changed? What is that like? And of course, there's never any single story, but it is interesting to hear hundreds of Christian parents talk a little bit about what that journey's been like and to be able to share that with others. And these are just some ways to keep up with me if you may want to hear me before you commit to anything like that. But we do have a Facebook page, a web presence. Twitter's kind of like being in middle school all over again, so I'm not recommending that, but and I have offered that these slides will be made as PDFs that can go out to attendees of this, so you don't feel like you have to get everything. I know the print can be a little small. I want to start with something that was kind of a mental exercise for me when I've always worked with transgender experiences throughout my whole career. My training was primarily around sexual orientation and identity, but I would always have cases referred to me around gender. So sexual identity is the act of labeling yourself based on your sexual attractions. When you say you're gay, queer, bi, or straight for that matter, you're using sexual identity. Gender identity is your experience of yourself growing up as a boy or a girl, or as an adult, as a man or a woman, or a different experience of gender than that. So I'd always seen people with gender issues, but it had always been such a rare, phenomenon. I wouldn't see that many cases, but I'd always seen them. And we've seen a dramatic rise in that, and it's become more culturally salient. I think Time magazine, maybe 2015 or so, had Laverne Cox as the transgender tipping point was the title of the cover of that magazine. So anyway, years ago, I tried to make sense of how it was. I thought there were conflicts around sexual identity. I had no idea how conflictual the conversation was around gender identity. So I was just trying to make sense of it. And I came up with 3 explanatory frameworks that function as lenses through which people see this topic. And so you'll probably, as you hear me talk about research and people I know, you're going to be hearing me through those lenses. So let me go over them with you and invite you to think a little bit about which ones resonate with you. And I'm not asking you to pick one to the exclusion of the other two. I'm asking you, what are the things that they might be getting right? What are some qualities about them? Because ultimately, just to give you I end up telling the reader, I think we should integrate the best aspects of these lenses rather than pick one. But let me go over them just briefly. The first one is something I originally called an integrity lens. So I'm just going to be advancing this. I don't know if our tech person could, yeah, thank you. Okay, what I say here is that folks who are drawn to this lens would say there's an integrity to male-female differences that God intended at creation. And usually they're drawing on the stories of creation from Genesis 1 and 2, and they're saying that the male-female distinction, that male and female brought together in the covenant of what we describe as marriage lays the parameters for what's morally permissible sexual behavior within the covenant of marriage. Outside of that is morally impermissible behavior. And so the adoption of a cross-gender or other gender identity goes against the integrity of those male-female distinctions that God intended at creation. Okay? So I called it an integrity lens. And for this group, this is largely then a moral concern. You're making a bad decision. I would say the downside of this lens has been when ministry says things like it's willful disobedience, that you have this gender discordance. And it's almost like saying you made a bad series of choices, and if you could make better choices and kind of walk that back, we would be really doing good ministry with you. So I think that's the upside of that. I think it is a biblically faithful starting point to begin with Genesis 1 and 2. But some of the ministry applications have not always been as helpful. And then the second lens I described as more of something not functioning properly. So over however many of dozens of cases you would have where your gender identity corresponds with your biological markers, I mean chromosomes, gonads, genitalia. For most people's experience, your gender identity corresponds with those markers. In rare instances, there's a discordance. That discordance is better understood as a variation that you could expect. You could probably predict that for a proportion of the population, gender identity is not going to correspond with their biological markers. And so in that sense, it's a non-moral reality you respond to with compassion. So I called it a disability lens. So a proportion of the population, for example, has hearing loss. You don't put it in a moral category. You say, well, something's not functioning properly. Now, we haven't always thought of things like that, like eyesight and hearing. I mean, the disciples in John 9 go to Jesus and say, who sinned that this man was born blind? Did his parents sin? Did he sin? And so it's not like we've never thought about it in those terms, but today we don't think about it in those terms. We think of something not functioning properly. Now, if you're a Christian drawn to this lens, you would say, well, why wouldn't things function properly? And you would say, well, because the created order is fallen. And so the Christians drawn to this lens are thinking about it through Genesis 3, the story of the fall in Genesis 3. They believe in Genesis 1 and 2, but they minister out of the story of the fall in Genesis 3, emphasizing things not functioning properly. So they're less likely to try to restore creational intent. The first group, the integrity group, their ministry approach is often to restore creation. And that raises a number of questions that we could grapple with together. How effective is that? What does that look like? What do people say about that? Okay, so we have our first two lenses. Let me read one account from a friend of mine who wrote about this. Now, she has hearing loss, and she took me out of the gay debate into the deaf debate to make this point. She says, now you're not going to be able to see this. She says, in the world of hearing loss, you have those who are deaf and those who are deaf. These two groups are well distinguished and identified. Anyone who uses capital D deaf knows that she's referring to something more than small d deaf. People who are deaf comprise a culture. They do not see themselves as having a disability. Instead, they see themselves as a people group with their own language and culture. On the other hand, those who are deaf with a lowercase d do not see hearing loss as an identity. Instead, they see it as a disability or a medical condition. This group is more likely to be oral. That is, they often undergo intensive training to lip read. They use their voice to communicate instead of using sign language. Some might also seek a cochlear implant. When they say, I am deaf, they are not saying, I am deaf, with a capital D. And at times there's contention between the groups because of a conflict in how each group understands its experience of hearing loss. For example, those who are deaf with a capital D see cochlear implants as threatening and an extreme offense. They don't believe anything needs to be fixed. They celebrate their identity as deaf. Now, what my friend's doing is she's taking us in, she's reminding us that within the LGBTQ community, within that mainstream, there are those who are countercultural to the LGBTQ mainstream, who the vast majority of the LGBTQ community would celebrate their identity as transgender or gay. But there's always been a subculture, a counter-narrative that's lived against that grain for a variety of reasons, and they might see it more like something not the way it was supposed to be, to paraphrase Neil Plantinga Jr. Not the way it's supposed to be, okay? And this points us to the third lens. So the third lens is where the rest of culture is rapidly moving toward. And Christians grapple with this. You may be grappling with, but it would say that the variations in gender, the gender discordance that I'm talking about, is not a concern to be corrected. It's not a condition to be empathized with. It reflects a culture to be celebrated. And so people within the community years ago landed on the word transgender as the way to express themselves publicly and politically when they used to have designations for them that were more medical and psychiatric. And so years ago, they divorced themselves from that framework and they said, no, no more. We're going to be known as transgender. So transgender becomes an umbrella term for many ways in which people experience or express or live out a gender identity that does not correspond with their biological markers. Okay, so I don't know how many of you years ago have been watching Jazz Jennings. Jazz still a darling of the transgender community, but she's been kind of interviewed by Barbara Walters and others since she was maybe 4 or 5. One of the youngest documented cases of a biological male raised as a girl since about 4 or 5. And when Barbara Walters came to visit the family for like a second time, Jazz was maybe 11. And she's interviewing Jazz's siblings in front of Jazz about Jazz. And she says to the older siblings, she says, how do you explain Jazz to your friends? And the older sister steps up and says, well, I tell them it's a disorder. I tell them it's not something that she chose. And Barbara Walters had been doing this for a few years. She knows what just happened. So she turns to Jazz and says, Jazz, what's it like for you to hear your sister talk about you that way? And Jazz says, I don't like that word, disorder, because to be transgender is to be special or unique because that's who I am. Now, if you've ever watched this reality show, you know that this is not a question of not loving one another. They love each other within this family. But the older sister is anticipating that first lens, that integrity lens from her peer group. And she tries to get ahead of them and says, it's not something that she chose. It's not willful disobedience. It's a disorder. She didn't choose this. So the sister is using the disability lens to counter the anticipated integrity lens of her peers. And Jazz is listening to this saying, I can't get on board with either of those things because the way you talk about me is either as a choice that I made, that I know I didn't choose this experience of discordance, or a condition that I have, and I can't really get excited about that, but I see it as a culture to be celebrated. I am special. I am unique. So when you think about these three lenses, I don't want you to so much land on one and say the rest have nothing to offer. With some intellectual humility, could we look at the three lenses and say, what are they getting right before we critique them? And then I don't think in a room this size, we'd have consensus on an integrated aspect of these three lenses. I'm happy to share how I integrate them, and maybe we could run with that, but or just we could critique that. But but let me say the benefits. I use this all the time in my work as a psychologist, and I do serve as an elder in my church, and I use this a lot when people come to see me. I often send them an article that I wrote where I explain these three lenses in more layman's terms, and I invite people to kind of see which lens resonates for them. But I think it helps people locate themselves and family members, or maybe people in your church. Which lenses are they drawn to and why? I think it helps people avoid speaking past one another. In fact, much of the culture war in our society is between proponents of the first lens and proponents of the third lens, really speaking past one another. But very few people want to hear your lens. Most people want to declare their lens to other people, whether it's integrity, or celebrate. Very few people want to take the time to listen. So what I do in counseling and what I would do in ministry is invite people to tell me which lens they're drawn to and how it came to capture their imagination. What is it about that really resonates with you? So I can understand what's preceded this moment of ministry. And then I think this facilitates what psychologists would call cognitive complexity, helping see through the eyes of the other. To do that is not to concede a position you disagree with. It's just helping you understand. I would do this with any issue that someone came to me for help with. How do you see this? How did you come to see this? And then I would have my own reference points, and we would begin to come alongside that person in a manner that we would now call ministry, okay? So a couple of foundational issues, and again, I apologize for the size of the slides. I wasn't quite sure the setup, but let me just, I've defined a few terms already. Probably the one that gets a lot of attention is the difference between gender and sex. And I was just critiqued recently by some brother in Christ, who was disappointed that another Christian psychologist makes this distinction. But the only thing it really refers to is biological sex usually refers to chromosomes, gonads, genitalia. Gender is usually the psychological and social aspects of being male or female, being a man or a woman. As a Christian, they are meant to correspond. They are meant to be related to each other in meaningful ways. So I'm not saying that they're completely arbitrary experiences. And your gender identity is the label you use to express that experience. And that can be endless. And I'll show you examples of that in a little bit. So transgender, umbrella term. Cisgender was the word used to describe everybody else who's not having this discordance of their gender identity. When your gender identity corresponds with your biological markers, the word that was created to explain you is cisgender. Cis means this side of, trans means across to the other side, so you're like a transatlantic flight. So a transgender experience, properly understood, should be the classic case of a person who says, I'm a woman trapped in the body of a man, okay? But it's an umbrella term. So if someone came to me and said, I'm trans, I wouldn't assume that it means a cross-gender identity. I would develop the kind of relationship where I could ask them to say a little bit more about what trans means for their experience, right? And then non-binary is, I thought for a long time it was kind of a small group of people in the transgender community, but it's anything but that. It's a pretty large percentage of the transgender community who would say that their identity is outside the binary, or it's in between the binary of man and woman. So it's not a cross-gender identity, it's things like gender, and these are what I would call emerging gender identities. It's gender fluid, it's gender expansive, it's agender, it's bigender, it's pangender, it's gray gender. I just gave you 2 pages, and I stopped there, of emerging gender identities. And this is so non-binary is another umbrella term for a splintering of gender categories that is endless. And I'm not saying that to be antagonistic to the community who's creating this terminology. What I'm trying to say from a ministry standpoint is none of us were raised with the wide array of categories for gender that you're now asked to minister to. So if you're 14 or 15, if you have people in your faith community who are 14, they're growing up with a splintering of gender categories that is without end. Gender identities, emerging gender identities that they can land on. And you and I were not raised in a society with that same splintering, that unending vista of possibilities. And yet we minister to young people in that space. So in some ways, we're going to be ministering to their own exposure to linguistic constructs we were never exposed to. So that's an area for us for prayer and equipping and discernment. How do we minister to that? Because they're meaningful to them, even though we have no frame of reference for it ourselves. Now, what does this look like in terms of prevalence estimates? I gave you a range here, and also a breakdown by race and ethnicity, and then a breakdown by generation. You see a slightly higher percentage for African American and Hispanic, contrasting with white. You see a higher percentage with Gen Z versus millennials versus Gen X and boomers. And so we're going to get into why that is. Like, why are we seeing a rise among younger people? It's one of the many areas of controversy here. And then I wanted to give you an idea of what they actually present as. So 33% identify as transgender women. So it's a biological male who experiences himself as a woman. 29% transgender men, biological female who presents themselves as a man. And then I mentioned that non-binary is a substantial percentage of the transgender community. In this transgender survey, this is 28,000 adult transgender people in the U.S., it was 35% identifying as non-binary. And then I also broke that down with the survey by race and ethnicity, so you can have an idea for that as well. Now, let me give you a little bit of a developmental perspective on this. I think it's been helpful to think about this in childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, and adulthood. But normally we think of this as, when did this discordance first occur in your life? And so we usually think early onset, prior to puberty, or late onset, puberty onward. I know that's two huge categories there, but when they surveyed those 28,000 transgender adults, they asked them, when did you first experience your gender as you do today? And 60% of adults in that survey said, I first experienced my gender the way I do today before age 11. 60% recalled experiencing their gender that way. So early onset. 40% anywhere from the beginning of puberty through into their 20s or older, for the very first time experience their gender the way that they do. So someone could, in theory, experience their gender differently at 25, 28, 29. It's not common. It's much more common to experience it at a much younger age. One of the other debates that we have in our field is whether this ever just desists. Now, what I mean by that is a person can have what we call gender dysphoria. So dysphoria is a negative emotional state that's associated with that discordance between gender identity and biological markers. So euphoria is a positive emotional state, dysphoria is a negative emotional state tied to that discordance. So when people have gender dysphoria, there's only about a dozen studies that have been conducted, but every study that has been published shows that roughly 75% of those cases resolve. They desist if you don't do anything. Just let them grow up. Anywhere from 60-something% to 90-something% across these 12 studies. But many people in my field don't like those 12 studies, and they're trying to move away from the desistance debate to say that it's really apples and oranges. They're not really desisting. They were never transgender to begin with. So they're sort of holding to kind of an essentialist understanding of their diverse gender identities and saying, we got it wrong. And it is true that in those cases of desistance, most of those people grow up to be gay or bisexual or have some other experience of their sexuality. But the dysphoria that they described or was reported in childhood, that abates. So that's called desistance. And this is important for ministry because parents will often come to you and say, what should we do with our 5-year-old or 6-year-old or 7-year-old? And a lot of times what people do is they double down on gender stereotypes. And they try to get their boy to be tougher. They try to get their girl to be more effeminate. And those interventions have not been shown to be helpful in this realm, okay? And so what sisters tell us is that when my parents did that for me, what I learned was I was not good enough the way that I was. I had to be something I just wasn't. And it felt very manipulative and sometimes abusive. So I don't know of a protocol that's any better than 75% of the cases resolving on their own. So there's something to not doing anything. It's kind of a wait and see is a posture that some psychologists have taken. I would just describe it as gender patience. Like, just let this unfold. Let this play out without giving the message that they're somehow inadequate or they're not enough. Now, a lot of times people ask me, well, aren't just kids just being kids and now we're creating this by saying that they're atypical? Well, I will tell you that when I started my career, I would get a referral of a child at about a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio. It would be a boy to a girl. I mostly get boy referrals of early onset cases because there's not much latitude in how a boy can behave before parents are concerned. But for girls, it's quite expansive, the ways that you can be a girl. In fact, we have a positive word in English for this. You can be a tomboy, okay? But there is no equivalent positive word in English for a boy being gender atypical. So it's much more narrow. And I would get those referrals. It doesn't mean that they're gender dysphoric or transgender or anything like that. It might be that they're just more expansive in how they express themselves as a boy, but it doesn't bring us into this conversation, okay? So that's actually something that a good psychologist would rule out before they would ever get to a conversation about gender dysphoria. Are they just within the wide realm of what it is to be a boy or it is to be a girl? That's kind of the first thing we ask. The other reason why this is important is that one of the newest directions of care is whether we should do blocking. And blocking was developed for precocious puberty, where someone was going into puberty at a very young age, and you could block them from continuing into puberty at that very young age and delay them so they could go through more with their cohort. And so some people have kind of taken that approach and applied it to gender dysphoric children and said, could we block them from going through puberty, and believing that puberty will be really painful for that person, block them from that, and then give them another year or two to figure this out, and then we can either take them off the blockers and they'll go through puberty as they would have, or we can use cross-sex hormones and they can go through puberty the way they experience their gender. So this is controversial. You're probably checked out on me right there, but okay, this is happening, and it's led to some states banning medically affirmative, it's called medically transgender affirmative care in this area. Others advancing it rapidly in some states. I would say that in my field, it's not evenly divided. My field prefers the medically affirmative approach, just to be clear about that. Doesn't mean I do, I'm just saying the field does. So this goes back to the desistance issue. Those people for whom this desisted, what they said was going through puberty mattered. It's almost as though, now both persisters and desisters feared going through puberty. They didn't want to see their body change. They didn't want to develop secondary sex characteristics. They were fearful of it. But when they went through it, the desisters said, essentially, it's like my body voted, and it consolidated my gender identity with my biological markers. And so puberty ended up becoming a very, very important part of desistance. Now, I will need to tell you that for sisters, puberty was just as bad as they feared it would be. It was awful. And, you know, if a natal male grows to 6'3", that natal male is 6'3", and if they transition now, they're 6'3", okay? So part of the argument for blocking is that it has a more convincing appearance afterwards. So anyway, this is the things that I deal with. I think you will be facing these issues. Families will be wrestling with this. A more recent conceptualization in our field is more from Christina Olson and the Trans Youth Project, and she's been following transgender youth for 5 years and finding that about 7% retransition, meaning they might have a cross-gender identity and then they're more non-binary. Some of them actually identify now as cisgender, but it was only 2.5% of the kids in her project. Most of them continued down the path that they were on when they transitioned at a young age. So this is the direction that secular psychology is moving, and I want you to be aware of that because it's a very influential source of authority within much of society. And so Christina would want to normalize the exploration of gender identity as a normal thing. And I'm not so much against exploring gender identity as I am treating gender as a social construct, or gender identity is completely invented by society. As a Christian, gender is meant to correspond with our biological markers from creational intent. It's a different thing to say, okay, as a result of the fall, there's instances where that doesn't happen. But gender ideology would want to say that that's all up for grabs and that you can choose those things and you can bend those things to your will. And I think the church would need to position itself saying, no, that's not something that we would do, but we realize that it can be an experience for people in a fallen world. So we don't want to be extreme in kind of either side of this, advancing a gender ideology, but also not so committed to pushing back against the ideology that we don't recognize that this can actually be an experience for a percentage of the population. And that's going to put you in a very difficult position where you're likely going to be attacked from both sides. Not being sufficiently trans-affirming and not being sufficiently protective against ideology to denounce anything in this space or everything in this space. So in other words, you'll be right where I am. So hey, well, welcome. So, I love some good company. Y'all are good people. Be great to have you. But as I mentioned, we're seeing a remarkable rise in cases today of late onset cases that we never really would see when I started my career. Something is going on. So this is from the UK clinic, the Tavistock Clinic in the UK. And you're seeing not only a rise in late onset cases, adolescent cases, for the first time reporting gender identity concerns, but a ratio of girls to boys. And this has led people to say, I wonder what's going on here. So let me give you two theories as to what's going on, and then let me give you mine. So one theory is social contagion. And this comes out of the eating disorder literature. And in the eating disorder literature, it's very well established that eating disorders typically are one of the most culturally bound syndromes we have compared to like schizophrenia or depression or things like that. Eating disorders can be derived from societal standards for what body weight and shape and size should be, standards of beauty, things like that. And those messages can be communicated, especially within peer groups and in media and entertainment and society, and that adolescent females are more susceptible to those messages than adolescent males. And there's a ratio of more females to males susceptible to the onset of an eating disorder or the maintenance of an eating disorder through this idea of social contagion, where there's peer group passing along of these messages that creates or maintains eating disorders among peers. And so this is called social contagion. It's well established in the eating disorder literature. So some people have copied and pasted that over to the gender question and said, isn't that what we're seeing today around gender? So I'm not against that idea that there's peer group influence and social influence. I don't think we have sufficient research that I'm comfortable using the phrase social contagion at this moment. I'm not against it being studied more. I'd like to see it studied more, but I think right now it'd be a little antagonistic to say that's all that's going on. But there definitely can be peer group influence. The other explanation for what's going on is just self-awareness, that these people have always been there, and society's approval of them allows them to have the courageous option of naming their truth today. Well, I mean, that's undoubtedly true. You see an increase because there's greater social acceptance of it, yes. I've evaluated people in their 50s and 60s who have said to me, I would love to be 16 or 17 today, because when I was 16 or 17, I had no idea what was going on. I remember one person said as an emerging adult that they were scouring libraries and going through medical textbooks to find out what was wrong with them, because they thought they were suffering from psychosis, that they were schizophrenic. And they landed on gender, whatever the language would have been at the time, and they said, like a light bulb went off, that this was a real thing. And so you know that there's no 16 or 17-year-old who's doing that today. No one's going through medical textbooks to figure out what's wrong with them, but they are going on the internet saying, what does it mean to be transgender? And maybe that's my experience. So these are the two most prominent explanations for the phenomenon today. The field that I'm in is not evenly divided here. The field I'm in lands towards the self-awareness model. I think it's undoubtedly true, but naive. To say that that's all that's going on is naive of my colleagues. Social contagion, undoubtedly true that there's peer group influence, but I think it's a bit reductionistic to say that that's all that's going on. It's a bit dismissive as well. In my own work, I've suggested that, that both biological processes and social processes are at play. And what I've landed on is what I'm drawing here on a Canadian philosopher named Ian Hacking. And he describes a looping effect. I'll try to explain it real briefly, but I'm not going to be able to do justice to it. But essentially, he distinguishes human kinds from natural kinds. And a natural kind, like a chemical compound, does not interact with how it's categorized. But human kinds, we interact with how we are categorized. And one of the significant ways we categorize people in our society is through mental health diagnoses. And so he takes the example of things like multiple personality disorder, which we now have a new name for, but when he was doing it, there was a craze for a while where people were being overdiagnosed at higher rates than ever before with multiple personality disorder. It was socially salient. It was in entertainment. It was in media. And people were being diagnosed with it left and right. So he documents that case as a phenomenon. And so what I did was I suggested there's something like that going on here. And he would say there's a classification that we give people, and then there's the people who interact with how they're being classified. And then there are the institutions that arise to sort of study and listen to them. And then there's what becomes conjectural knowledge, what becomes on The View, on Ellen, on Jimmy Fallon. And then there's the experts who get to settle debates and determine what's real knowledge. And then you have a new classification. So I just applied this to gender dysphoria because even prior to this diagnosis, we used to call it gender identity disorder. So if this is not your experience, imagine, if you would, how you would think about yourself if the diagnosis was an identity disorder versus dysphoria. An identity disorder says there's something fundamentally flawed in your identity. There's something wrong. There's something discordant. A dysphoria says, we don't want you to have distress. The problem you have is you're distressed. We want to alleviate your dysphoria. But we're not claiming that the identity is an issue. It's the dysphoria that's an issue, okay? So even that shift would fundamentally change how you think about yourself, how you think about your experience, and how you think about your group of people, your tribe of people with discordant gender identities, okay? So that's going on. So you have the people who have had their own sense of history and personhood related to this. You have institutions who study them, listen to them, interview them, learn from them. And then you get the gender unicorn, you get conjectural knowledge, you get, of course, there's 50 plus genders. So the Christian who says, no, I think there's a binary, and I don't think it's a source of oppression, will now be on the outside of knowledge that's shared within a society about sex and gender. So Christians are going to be increasingly on the outside of that conversation because of our adherence to a binary that we don't see as a source of oppression. It could be wielded as a source of oppression to people, but the theology itself is not a source of oppression, would be my position. And then you have the experts. A lot of the debates that I shared with you today, desistance and persistence, things like that, are not going to be settled by me. It's not going to be settled by you. It's going to be settled by experts in the field who get to determine what's true knowledge about this topic. And that's going to lead to a new classification. So you say, well, Mark, where does the peer group influence? Where about that social contagion? I think that's in conjectural knowledge. I think that part of this looping effect is where you're going to have peer group influence. Okay, so what does this dysphoria actually feel like? This person says, on my bad days, the feeling of I don't belong where I should, or I don't belong in this body lingers like an upset stomach. A more recent development is vehemently feeling that I'm sick of feeling this way, and I just want to be normal. Or this person said, gender dysphoria for me is the hiss of an old-time radio, a sound which can be ignored with some effort in order to hear the broadcast, but cannot be extinguished without pulling the plug. It's always been there long before I understood what was making the noise. Or this Christian I interviewed said it's like puzzle pieces that won't fit together, odd disconnection between body and self-identity. I look around and I think, how is it that it fits together for you? So I think what you're going to face in your faith communities are multiple presentations of diverse gender identities. You're going to have, in a sense, classically transgender presentations, if you will. You're going to have emerging gender identities that are increasing, and you're going to have searching teens who a generation ago would have landed on some other socially salient topic, but today they're going to land here. It gives them a sense of identity and community. And then among those three groups, some of them will warrant the diagnosis of gender dysphoria and be under the care of a mental health professional. But funneling down, what you're going to have in front of you is a person navigating gender identity. And so distinguishing, discerning, walking with them, I think is going to be incredibly difficult. And you probably didn't need to bring me here to tell you that. But for whatever it's worth, it is incredibly difficult for me, and I work with this population every week, and I work in this space all the time, and it's very difficult for me to discern what I'm seeing in front of me, even with careful evaluations. So let me talk a little bit about levels of engagement with this population. It's been helpful to me as an elder and in other roles that I have to think about levels of engagement across three lines, that there is a political identity, there is a public identity, and there is a private identity. So what I mean by this is when you minister to people, it's been really helpful to me to discern what level of identity am I engaging this person in, because I would minister to people differently. For example, in political identity, this is the activist. This is not most people in this space. Most transgender people are not activists. But whatever small percentage of people are activists, you would relate to them differently. And most of us are not called to minister to activists. I do sometimes at APA. I do sometimes rarely get protesters to my talks. One time I did have a protester. He made a video calling for all of his LGBTQ brothers and sisters to come to my other previous campus. We're going to come and we're going to stare this son of a gun down. I'm editing this lightly for this audience, but they were going to come and protest me on my own campus as I was giving a talk about issues. And anyway, I was talking to a friend of mine, and my basic brand is borrows from Richard Mao. It's convicted civility, seasoned with compassion. That's the approach that I take in these conversations. And so one of my friends was talking to me about what does that approach take to people? Convicted civility, seasoned with compassion. And we landed on let's call him, let's invite him, let's have him be a guest at campus. I mean, they were coming anyway. So invite him to be a guest. So I did. And I said, look, I'd love to get together with you afterwards. Maybe we could talk a little bit about what you heard and what you experienced. So he came. They filled up first several rows. They stared daggers at me the whole time. And I spoke like I'm speaking to you now. So he gets done, he gets back, makes another video, and he said, well, it wasn't quite what I expected. It was kind of interesting. He had some interesting findings, I didn't agree with everything he said, but it was kind of interesting to hear him give his perspective. So we had coffee, and he said, I was absolutely eviscerated by my community for not tearing you down, even if it meant misrepresenting your talk. He said, I'm done. I'm done with activism. I didn't even know it was something you quit, but he was like, I'm done. And he had some other interests that he wanted to do. And another activist, we had coffee as well, and we hit it off. We just kind of connected as just our humor and everything. And he said, look, when I met you, I thought that the way people talked about you, you'd have smoke coming out of your nostrils, you had horns on your head, but like you're one of the nicest people I've ever met. And he was raised in the church. And because of how he was treated by students and other people on campus, he actually revisited the faith of his childhood, and he rededicated his life to Christ. He went to the church that I went to back in Virginia. So there's a kind of like affirming the personhood beneath the activism. Under every assertive activist was at one time a sincere struggler in this space. And you've got to prayerfully consider how to minister to the person underneath the activism if the Lord will open that door. Whenever I can identify superordinate goals, I do. The institute I ran in Virginia, we sometimes would do an annual march against suicide and depression because LGBTQ people are overrepresented in that population. We would sometimes volunteer at a homeless shelter because LGBTQ youth are overrepresented among people who are homeless. Okay? We did the same at an AIDS, HIV ministry. It was actually not a ministry, it was a community service that looked at people with HIV and AIDS and cared for them. We volunteered there because this population is overrepresented among people with HIV and AIDS. Okay? So whenever you can find superordinate goals, you stand arm in arm with people that otherwise there would be disagreements about. But I think that's been a good thing for me to do, and I relate with Mao's convicted civility. But most people are not activists. Most people, it is their public identity. What I mean by that is they're your neighbors. They're your extended family member. They're the person delivering your pizza. And so here, they're not an activist. They're also not asking for help. So to me, it's, is that private identity or public? Oh, okay, sorry. Let me go to, whoa, they're all private identity. Okay, all right. Sorry, this is a clerical error on my part. Okay, so for me with this population here, it's hospitality to my neighbor. It's respect to them, being genuine. You already, and your congregants already have the ability to do this. You relate to them as you relate to anybody else whose demographic characteristics you're not that familiar with, okay? So, for most people who are transgender, their being transgender is a demographic characteristic. And so you relate to them out of that, and you help your parishioners relate to people who have a different demographic characteristic than they're familiar with. So it's hospitality, it's relating to them, it's being genuine, it's being warm, it's having them over for dinner and taking them up on their invitation to have you over. It's those types of things. So they already have this ability. Think about your neighbor who's an agnostic. Think about your neighbor who's an atheist. They have a different demographic characteristic, but you know how to relate to them as a Christian. So don't stumble on the fact that they're identifying as LGBTQ. If they don't know Christ, and your other neighbor who's an agnostic doesn't know Christ, neither of them knows Christ. So you have within yourself, by God's provision in your life, you already know how to relate to people who don't share the same demographic characteristics that you have. Equip your parishioners to relate in like manner. And then for the person for whom this is their private identity, by which I mean they're asking you for help. This is the smallest. It's not as small maybe as activists, but it's a group of people that you're not as likely to see as public identity, where they're demographically just different. They're asking you to walk with them with this. What do you do with them? So I try to create spaces in my office and in my community that are emotionally and spiritually secure. Now, what I mean by secure is they're not spaces governed by anxiety and fear. So in your areas of ministry, identify where are we most likely to have fears around this topic. And I want to invite you to reduce fear-based ways of doing ministry. What I've found from surveying Christians in this area who struggle with their gender discordance is they want secure places, your office, my office, where they can take their faith seriously, they can take their gender seriously, and they can take how to relate them seriously. I remember meeting with a woman who suffered from dysphoria in her marriage. The husband and wife came to see us, and the woman was suffering from gender dysphoria. And we're very careful, because she's a Christian. We talk and we assess their religious faith, but we're trying to be careful that they're going back to their faith community, because they come from all over the country, going back to their faith community. So I asked her, is there someone you could confide in your faith community who could sort of walk with you as you ask the spiritual questions you're asking us today? And she said, I already did that. I said, tell me about that. So we met with our pastor, and he said, after 10 minutes, you're going to have to pick up your cross and follow Christ. And she looked at her husband, and she looked at me, and she said, I don't even know what that means for me with gender. I don't know what that means for me. And she looked at her husband, and she looked back at me, and she said, I don't even think my pastor knows what it means. You see, because for him, it was kind of like a Pez dispenser. He just kind of said something that he had, it sounded right, but it wasn't ministry. Ministry is not proclaiming things from a mountaintop. It's stepping into the valley with people and saying, I'm going to walk with you in this. So I would never say something like, pick up your cross, unless I was doing it, and I actually knew how to do it, and I knew what it looked like for someone with discordant gender identity. And I wouldn't just declare you do that. I would lift it with you. Let's do this together. This is ministry. I'm sorry, I was trying to preach up in here. So, sorry. Not really my role, so I'm going to step back from that. Okay. Look, I was doing an interview of Christians navigating these issues. I was meeting with one person, Christian, faithful Christian, seminary trained, and they suffered from gender dysphoria. And they said, there are very few resources. I'm still dealing with gender dysphoria daily. Transitioning is the main secular response. Healing through counseling is the main Christian response. Dealing with it daily is the reality for most of us. Friends, I think that's what you're going to see in ministry. Most people are going to hear transition, that's the way, that's the path. Others are going to say, get your healing on, have enough faith. The reality is most of them are going to deal with it every day, and it's going to be very painful. To differing degrees. Dysphoria is not one thing. You can have mild cases of dysphoria, and you can have moderate and severe cases. One thing that I do when I meet with people is I try to thicken the plot around the idea that transitioning is what everybody should do. So the way that I think about this is that in our society, and even in our field, my field, we often present it as a mountaintop experience that everybody should aspire to. So if you have gender dysphoria, you pursue a mountaintop experience. Well, what is that? Medical transition. Use hormones, use gender surgeries, and you'll achieve the mountaintop experience that you should move towards. One of the greatest hesitations I have in making a diagnosis of gender dysphoria is that I'll put them on the trail that leads to the mountaintop in their mind. And so when I look at research on how many people actually use these medical interventions who struggle with this, the Kaiser Family Foundation published this just in March of this year. And they said that only 31% of adults reported using hormone treatment or blockers, and only 16% used gender confirmation surgery. But it's kind of like when you talk to a teenager about whether their friends are sexually active, they'll say, well, everybody's having sex. Well, if it's not true and not everyone's having sex, you're more likely to reconsider whether you're going to be sexually active. I want my clients to reconsider the idea that everybody's getting medical interventions, because most adults are not getting medical interventions. Now, most of them will look at transitioning some of the time or most of the time. They'll want to wear clothing that reflects how they experience themselves. They might do that privately. They might do it on the weekends. They might do it publicly. They might make a formal public social transition. But others just wear their hair a certain way. They wear their clothing that they prefer. They wear baggy clothing. They shave their legs. They do different things. And what they're doing is they're managing the dysphoria. So for me, what I do is I try to help. When I think of the three lenses, I think the biblically faithful starting point is the first lens. I do think we start with creation. What was God's creational intent? What I love about the second lens is the compassion and empathy for the person struggling in this area. And I minister out of this combination: biblical, faithful starting point, compassionate management of your dysphoria in the least invasive way possible. And then you say, well, Mark, what do you get out of the third lens? Aren't you at war with the third lens? Well, first of all, I'm not at war with the third lens. But I think of jazz. There's something compelling about that lens that the other lenses aren't addressing. What is it? It's an answer to identity and community that jazz finds compelling. So I don't have an answer for this, but as a Christian speaking to other Christians, I would say we have to address the need for identity and community that's being met by the diversity lens and isn't being met by the other two lenses. What is it about that affirmational posture that we could bring in our ministry to affirm their personhood as made in the image of God, with the complexities of the discordance in front of us? But we have to address identity and community to care well for this person. So thank you for this time together. We're going to have some Q&A, but thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks.
We appreciate you.
Yeah.
I've got some predictable questions, I think, and then we'll have some time for Q&A with everybody else as well. Mm-hmm. So when a pastor who's just starting to read about this, grapple with what you're saying, and this surprisingly, shockingly maybe comes into their office, and they don't feel at all expert about it, what's the first thing they should do?
Okay, let me tell you a little story here. So I had a pastor call me, and they had a transgender person call them and said, look, I was thinking about visiting your church on Sunday. I'm transgender. I was hoping that maybe we could have coffee before I came to church, just to see what I could come to expect, what it would be like. And so the pastor hung up with them and called me and said, hey, this just happened. And I said, well, call them back and take them up on the offer for coffee. And when you sit down with them, they were in their early 50s, I said, say this to them. Say that I feel like I'm meeting you at about chapter 7 of your life, and I haven't had a chance to hear about chapters 1 through 6, but I'd like to. And I guarantee you they've never had a Christian minister invite them to tell that story. Here's the thing. I don't think you can shepherd somebody at chapter 7 if you don't know what chapters 1 through 6 were like. So you have to shepherd based on the history a little bit and where they are today. So one thing I would start with is not reacting to what you see in front of you. In fact, I would try to discipline yourself to not react to people. We received some training in my field in not reacting to people, because I feel like I hear everything, and I'm sure you do too. So there's some element of non-reactance, and then curiosity and unpacking and asking good questions, letting them tell their story, and how they got to where they are today. And for me, I'm listening for the lenses. As they describe their experience, are they using words that are more associated with the first lens, the second lens, the third lens, and then based on that, I might ask some more questions to see if that lens really does resonate with them, the sets of assumptions that are maybe underlying that lens, because I would minister differently based on some of what they would say. Now, it's a younger person. I'm going to be listening for these new linguistic categories that are around the splintering of gender. I'm going to ask them a little bit about their first understanding of what those words mean and how that came to resonate with them. So those are some things that I do. I try to stay curious. Curiosity is the beginning of ministry, but it is not the end of ministry, and neither is hospitality. I was recently blessed by a sister who saw that differently, and she accused me of representing a hospitality approach to ministry in which hospitality is the ministry. And of course, I hope you hear my heart today. Hospitality is the beginning of a hearing for ministry. It is not ministry in and of itself to just be hospitable. Of course not. So anyway, I'll say more about that if there's interest. But.
So just to put a slightly finer point on it, not professionals like this room is full of, but what about volunteers in youth ministry or children? What can we do to help them understand something of what we've said today?
So I think children actually are not as complicated as we think they are. I think sometimes we want to protect children from this, but I don't think that's as helpful. I think they're exposed to these ideas at younger and younger ages. So it's more equipping them to engage and critically evaluate what they're hearing. So when my son and I were picking up pizza one time, he was probably 8, and we were getting our pizza, we were coming out, and one of the drivers was leaving with their delivery, and they were transgender, and they didn't pass. And my son at 8 had no filter whatsoever, and he just says, thankfully outside of the earshot of the person, that says, "Dad, what was up with that guy?" And I said, they had full breasts, just, but I said, "Peter, most people, they know themselves, like you know yourself to be a boy, and I know myself to be a man, and that matches how God gave us, like for us, penises and testicles, and I'll just name, that's kind of the approach we took. And but in some cases, that doesn't happen. And I think we just met someone where it didn't line up the way that it was meant to line up. And I just want you to think about the challenges that would leave that person facing. How do I live my life if those things don't line up the way they do for everybody else? So what I was trying to do with my son was lead a little bit more with compassion and empathy. That's not the norm. That doesn't mean the norm is a source of oppression, but it means that variations from the norm we should have compassion toward. Imagine what that would be like, was more the cognitive complexity angle I would want him to have. Now, as a Christian, I would later teach him and have taught him that this was God's intent is for those to line up. That's what God intended at creation. But so much of creation is not lining up the way it was intended. So we want to be compassionate the way we would want people to be compassionate towards us when our experiences don't line up with creational intent.
Yeah, amen. I can anticipate another question. As you know, the political strife and division that's in the world is, made manifest now, especially in the church since COVID and all that. So I can just imagine a working pastor trying to work out of your paradigm of patience, mm-hmm. and trying to work out of that paradigm of looking at this more demographic and with the idea that would produce some peaceful patience, mm-hmm. versus people in their congregation or in their vestry saying, heck no, man, this is a biblically moral issue. What are you doing advocating patience? How would you help us walk that line?
Yeah, so gender patience is not applied to the neighbor or the activist. Gender patience is to the parent who's parenting a child who's gender atypical. So when that child's gender atypical, rather than a fear-based approach to parenting. And most parents would tell me, and maybe they've told you, that they did not parent at their best when they parented out of fear. That's been my experience as a parent of 3. My best parenting did not occur when I parented out of my anxieties. So when I talk about gender patience, it's specific to parents not parenting out of their fear for what their child being gender atypical could mean. And so now they double down on gender stereotypes and they try to toughen them up or soften them up or whichever way your stereotype goes. But to be patient with their child's expression, because often children are trying to tell you what they're experiencing. Gender dysphoria is rare. If it were to occur, your child would continue to try to communicate what they're experiencing to you. They may do things that all children do. Like boys will grab their mother's high heel shoes and put them on and say, "Mom, I've got high heel shoes like you've got high heel shoes." Or they'll put a towel around their waist and say, "I've got a dress like you have a dress." Or they'll put it around their head and say, "I've got long hair like you've got long hair." A lot of boys will do that. And when you say to them as a mom, "Oh, you found my towel, that's great, can you throw that in the hamper?" and they don't have gender dysphoria, guess what? They'll throw that in the hamper and we're moving on with our day. When they do have gender dysphoria, they're trying to tell you something and they don't know how to tell you. So they're going to circle back and come back and come back to communicate something to you. So patience is letting that play out and not overreacting to the instances that might cause a parent anxiety. So when I'm ministering to a parent, as you would be, you're helping them have a place to talk about their fears and anxiety, which is you, which is maybe a home group, which is maybe counselor or whatever, but it's a place for that to be processed, to talk with somebody, so it doesn't come out with their 5-year-old sideways in less healthy ways, overreacting, right? That's gender patience.
Yeah. Is there any analog to us working with families for whom this has become an issue? Is there an analog of this patience for us pastors?
Well, I know that, maybe I'll just speak for myself. I often like to get client concerns or as an elder, ministry concerns wrapped up sooner than later. This is not a wrapped up sooner than later presentation. This is the long journey. What's given me some peace, and it might be helpful to you, is I go back to the chapters and I say, and I'll often say to people who come to see me, what's the title and what are the themes of the chapter that brought you to see me? So not just the chapters that preceded us. And then I might say, what's the chapter and what are the themes of the chapter you're hoping to write after we see each other? Like, where are you going? And as I pray about it, I'm asking God, help me to be faithful and loving and care well for the person in front of me during this chapter you've given me with them. But I know that their journey will have more chapters beyond my time with them. And their chapters came before I knew them. So I feel like there's a lot less pressure on me to finish the book of ministry with them in front of me. There are chapters beyond me, and there's going to be other contributors. And ultimately, I believe that the Spirit is the author of this book. I don't have to write the book. Neither does the person in front of me. I want them to be closer and closer to Christ so that the Spirit can guide them in writing chapters.
Amen to that. All right, let's. Thank you. Let's see what we've got out in our colleagues. So we've got a microphone coming around.
Hi, thanks, Mark, for sharing. You've clearly done a lot of work and a lot of studying. My question is, what is your understanding of attachment theory as it relates to same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria? And if you do see or experience a connection between the two, what implications does that have on our response in ministry?
Yeah, so attachment understandings would be the relationship between the child and their primary caregiver, which is usually their mother or father or combination. and that you can have attachment injuries in childhood. And one of the theories for the etiology or origins of homosexual orientation has to do with a lack of identification with the same gender parent that then becomes sexualized as they go through adolescence. And there's not been very good research on this being a consistent finding among adults who are gay or lesbian, speaking of their childhood. There are some studies showing a lack of connection to the same gender parent, but they're correlational, and they really haven't really had a robust data research to support it as a pathway to sexual orientation. And it's probably had its most consistent support in more older Freudian theories. Not that he framed it quite that way, but it's kind of where the attachment literature kind of picked up on some of that in more contemporary language. And I'm not sure how to put this. The church has not historically warmed to Freud. And I always thought it was interesting that when it came to the origins of sexual orientation, we hung on to this. I think I would be very cautious, because I don't think we know what causes homosexual orientations. To be fair, we don't know what causes heterosexual orientations, and we don't know what causes gender dysphoria, though we study some of the very same areas of the brain that we do with sexual orientation. I think the mistake that the church has made in the past is that we hyperclaimed theories of causation as though we knew with certainty what caused people to be gay, and now possibly we could do the same thing with transgender. We would hyperclaim theories of causation when we didn't have good support for it yet, and we would hyperclaim theories where we could create change. And I think in both cases we made a ministry pastoral error that led people to not trust the church. That we thought we knew what got them there, and I think there's multiple pathways to sexual orientation and gender discordance that we don't fully understand. So I'd rather say we don't know and lead with humility around that. But we hyperclaimed that, and then we hyperclaimed interventions that would resolve it in a way that has not been reliably shown to be the case in research, in a way that I would feel comfortable saying to someone that that resolution is likely for you. Now, let me be very clear about this. I'm not taking away from individual testimonies of people who have those experiences. Christianity is based on individual testimonies in many respects. But as a psychologist, I can't take the testimony of one person and say that that's likely to be the next person's story, because God might work in this person's life very differently than the other person's life. And so, from a ministry standpoint, you benefit from conducting research to see how likely is this person's testimony to be the next person's testimony. And when we don't have that support, I think it's better for ministry to be humble, not hyperclaim outcomes that we're not going to be able to reliably show. So for me, the lesson learned for me in this space has been humility on the front end of claims of how we get there, and humility on the back end of where we go in ministry from there.
I just want to underscore that as a bishop. That would be a beautiful culture in C4SO that I would love.
Mark, really appreciate your talk. Thank you. I'm right here.
Okay.
Hi.
Thanks.
I minister in the Bay Area in San Francisco, and for many people in my context, there is not only almost a litmus test that comes with these conversations. Mm-hmm. A woman that I know in my community talks about transgenderism in terms of the rise of left-handedness in the 20th century, kind of your self-awareness idea that like the explanatory factor for why transgenderism is so high now is because we're finally accepting it. We're not forcing people to use their right hand to draw. We're letting them use their left hand, which is natural to them. I guess my question is, I don't feel the need to engage at that political or ideological level, but I'm often invited or almost forced into those kinds of conversations from people who want to see if I'm safe or not. Do you have any I guess, wisdom in terms of like approaching those conversations with people who maybe aren't themselves gender dysphoric, but who have family members or friends that are, and are trying to figure out if I'm safe, if I'm somebody that they can be honest and open with, and really the only way that they can tell that is if I'm politically, ideologically aligned with them?
Yeah. Well, first, I would just remind us that most people are not going to have the language that we've talked about today. Most people's frame of reference is culture war terminology. You're either pro-trans, trans-affirming, or you're anti-trans. You're pro-gay or you're anti-gay. So the call to the church is to elevate the conversation so that we don't mirror that. We're not pro-gay or anti-gay. We're not pro-trans or anti-trans. Wait for it. We are pro the image of God in all people. There you go. That's what I'm just cueing the applause. That's terrible. So shameless. Okay. So when people are trying to sniff that out with me, like they're often using language and categories that are accessible to them to determine and assess where I am, but their language and categories are culture war terminology. So I never play into it in a way, because when I start to sound compassionate, even here people might leave thinking, gosh, that was almost kind of pro-trans. Like they might sort of put me in a category. What I'm asking you to do is not do that to people, including yourselves, and you can feel free not to do it with me, but just to, but actually reflect on, I'm borrowing language from the broader culture that's part of the problem. So when someone's sniffing that out with me, I thicken the plot. So when they start to say things like, what do you think causes this? Is it like the left-handedness kind of thing? What I learned in academics was the virtue of intellectual humility. And what that means is you always identify what they're getting right of any writer you ever read before you critique. What are they getting right? And so I'm sure that there's an element of what they're saying that's true. And I've said that part of what you're seeing is increased social acceptance, and that's why there's more cases. But I said, too, it's naive to think that's all that's going on. So in that moment with them, I might say, I think what you've just said, I think that's definitely a part of what is going on. Absolutely, I think you're right. I suspect there's other things going on as well, but I think what you've said is definitely part of what's going on. So you're agreeing with what you can, and you're extending the relationship into a horizon where more conversations could lead to other angles of entry into what else might be going on. That's what I would do.
Thanks, Mark. Well, we have time for one more, maybe two.
I'm curious if you can give us some advice for those of us who are walking with LGBTQ persons in our community, in our parish, when it comes to the point where we have to go different ways, where they've said, I think God might be inviting me to get married, and it's just hard. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've definitely had those relationships of people that I've ministered to, and I sometimes am criticized for ministering in a more of an open-ended manner, especially counseling. But I do that a lot because I don't dictate the terms of how people resolve it, and sometimes as they're figuring this out, they resolve that conflict in a way that's apart from orthodoxy, I think. And so, they know what my beliefs are. And so I remember one person who said that they were getting married, and my response was, I know how important that is to you. I had to choose my words very carefully because I couldn't celebrate with her what she wanted me to celebrate. It would be outside of what I think God wants for her. But man, the years I've known her, I know how important this is to her. And I could name that. There's a longing for intimacy that she will find in that relationship. The longing points to something very instructive for all of us. The longing for completion is kind of like when we fast and we refrain from food. Our hunger is meant to tell us that the desire for food will only be satisfied when we take in the bread of heaven. That when we feast on the Lamb. I mean, that's the whole point of what hunger is meant to communicate to us about our need. And we'll only be fully satisfied in eternity. And I think our sexual desire for completion in the other at all levels is meant to signal something like that too. We'll only be complete when we are part of the bride in the marriage with the bridegroom. So when she approximates that in this relationship, I can appreciate what she's trying to do, but I think it's in doctrinal error. And she knows I believe that. So I don't reiterate that. I don't have to go back over that. I can try to articulate what I can and acknowledge what it means to her. And I continue to be in relationship with her and with her wife, and I love them and I care for them. And I have a friend of mine who's gay who would even say it this way. I don't know if this is right or not, but she says, maybe they were even meant to love one another, but it was not meant to take this form. And I think there's something really interesting in that thought. Now, this is a friend of mine who's gay, and she's not ashamed of her sexuality, but she follows church teaching. She does not act on it genitally with any other woman, but she does serve in a crisis pregnancy center as a way to give her love away to other women. It's how she expresses her same-sex sexuality, is in love like that. I thought that was very interesting. She's not evangelical, and she's not part of the communities that I'd be a part of. And so in some ways, I really value her thinking about it outside the box. Like, that's a really interesting, creative way to think about your sexuality. So that's informed a little bit of how I respond to a friend who's made a decision that I think is ultimately in doctrinal error. But I can still love them, be in relationship with them. Now, I can't be in the same fellowship with them in my church. They wouldn't be able to be a member in my church. They wouldn't be able to be in leadership in my church. And in this one relationship we've had, there's some things that she can't do in areas that I work in because of the position she's taken and how she's embodied that in this relationship. And that's been a loss for her. And in some ways, it's been a loss for me because I enjoyed doing those things with her. So those are real things that we grieve. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. I stay engaged, and it's painful, but I think that's okay. I think it's the hardness of it, the painfulness of it, speaks to the love that we have for each other. But anyway, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Can we thank Mark, everybody?
Thank you.